Hello everyone. This issue in organizational communication lesson is about communication and change, perhaps one of the most frequently studied areas of, recently anyway, of organizational communication. As before on the other lessons, you should probably have some paper and a pen with you so you can answer the few questions that I ask at the beginning. There is also a self-assessment exercise that you can take after the lesson, or if you wanted to pause it now, you can take it now. I'd like you to think for a moment about the kinds of changes that you may have experienced in organizations that you've been a part of. Pick one organization and think about a change that you went through with it. There's a whole number of things. It could be anything as small as introducing an operating system or new software to a major restructuring or merger. How successful was that change? Did it do what it said it was going to? Did things get better or worse in the organization after the change? And then briefly explain why that's the case. Why did the change work or not? Spend a few minutes, think about those questions, jot down your answers, and they can be included in your reflection papers. With all due respect to David Bowie, there are a number of changes that organizations have gone through. And no, I'm not going to sing chit changes. But here's sort of the range of them. There are mergers, where two organizations agree to join with each other, usually to increase capacity and market share. Typically, these are organizations in relatively similar kinds of fields, and they come together. That means a certain amount of restructuring, perhaps some personnel changes, downsizing a little bit. Related to this are acquisitions, when a larger company buys out a smaller company. Again, the smaller company is usually absorbed into the larger one, and there are changes in structure and personnel. There's a clash of cultures sometimes, too, when this happens. Some time ago, my wife used to work for General Motors, but really she worked for an organization called Electronic Data Systems, which was a software engineering company. Electronic Data Systems was run on an almost military-like structure and culture. Very conservative dress code. Everybody had to follow orders. GM, on the other hand, a lot of the managers had been former auto workers. They'd come up through the ranks. They were roll up your sleeves, have a cigarette, and chat about things kind of people. And the culture clash between those two organizations was so great that at one point the president of EDS threatened to sue General Motors over the challenges his organization had been facing. Restructuring, adding divisions, taking divisions away, merging two separate divisions. Again, if you can think back to what we talked about in the first week, the various and sundry frames that we talked about, not only does structure change the nature of the communication, the flow and where messages go and who's connected to whom, but there are often, again, cultural differences between different departments. There's human resource concerns with regard to whether people need to be laid off, and a variety of things that happen. The introduction of new technology, a new operating system, new software, new machines, upgraded machines. Technology change has been a great focus of study for the last probably 15 or 20 years, partly because of the rapid rate of technological advances. Most people believe that or feel that Facebook has been around forever, when in fact it's only barely been around for 10 years. And so there's a new social media platform seemingly being introduced almost every week. Changes in rules and procedures. There's a certain way that you have done something up to one point in an organization, and then new rules come out. They could be working rules, they could be benefits rules, they could be a procedure for filing checks and filing for paperwork and keeping the budgets. Any of these changes necessitates a certain amount of time and energy, and if they go wrong, they can be challenging for the organization. Personnel additions, when you add somebody to an organization. Again, every person influences the culture of the organization and the interactions of the organization. If you make the wrong hire, the person doesn't fit or is downright toxic to the organization, then there could be challenges. And then finally, corporate culture changes, sometimes by design, where people feel that they can rewrite the mission statement, reshape the values of the organization, change the rights and rituals and slogans and words and things that get used to describe the organization, and that will in fact ultimately change the culture. By development, what I mean by that is when new people come into an organization and new generations of people, just over time with people going in and out of the company, a culture will probably begin to change. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the differences between older workers and younger workers in terms of attitude toward work and authority, the place that work plays in their lives, and those differences can be a change, and if they happen gradually, they sometimes sneak up on you until there's some sort of conflict in the organization. In order to understand change, we're going to look at several different areas. First, we're going to look at the characteristics of change itself, because the nature of a change, what you're asking people to go through, influences the communication and the sorts of things you have to address. We're going to look at the phases of change. Change goes through, or organizations go through several different phases as they're introducing new technology, ideas, etc. Those phases require certain kinds of communication at every stage in order to be successful. Characteristics of adopters. In this case, adopters are those people who will be making the change. They have received instructions on how to do it, and whether or not they make the change or want to make the change influences the communication that surrounds the change. And then finally, we'll look at the principles for communicating change across an organization. Some good ideas, I think, some things to remember about the strategy of communicating change. And then finally, I know I said finally a moment ago, related to this, we're going to look at change and the communication audits that you might perform for your organizations. So first, let's look at the characteristics of a change. An organization decides to do something, go in a different direction. The nature, the size, the scope, and so on of the change influences how that might work. The first characteristic to look at is the degree or the extent of change that's being expected. Is it a major change or a minor change? In this case, a major change might be a merger or an acquisition that drastically changes the structure of a company, that may in fact change the direction of the company, what it focuses on, and the sort of business strategy that they employ, or a minor change. You decide to move the furniture around the office, or there's a new procedure for filing some paperwork. Those things, while minor, are still require some communication in order to make sure everybody understands the change and is happy about it. The other characteristic related to degree of change is whether it is sudden or incremental. Sudden changes happen relatively quickly. They are often a result of a problem that has cropped up in the organization that needs immediate attention. A lot of crisis communication, both in organizational communication as a study and a field of study, and public relations, focus on sudden changes, or they could be incremental changes. That is, they are things that occur over time. So the example I mentioned a few moments ago about a younger generation of workers gradually entering the workforce, that's something that's been happening for a number of years. Slowly but surely, as millennials come of age and enter the workforce, and then the generation after them, the baby boom generation, the post-war baby boom generation, is beginning to leave organizations, and therefore it is less of an issue. Or there's still, if they're both in the same organization at the same time, there's a bit of a challenge there in terms of managing the culture. I will say about sudden change that a lot of sudden changes, while maybe not completely predictable, can be anticipated. I talk about this in crisis communication all the time, that while you might not know exactly what would happen if there's a cybersecurity breach, you do know that the likelihood of one happening is pretty high. So an organization should prepare for those things, even if it hasn't happened to them, even if they don't anticipate it happening, because there's a high likelihood that it could. And so while some changes seem sudden or crises seem sudden, they often give off some signals before they happen. The second big characteristic of change is the type of change. That is, what realm of the business does the change sort of affect? There are a number of things that come into play here in terms of the sort of common changes that happen in organizations. I gave a few examples at the outset of this lesson, but general categories include things like technological changes, big machine operations, new computers, new software, etc. Administration, how the organization is run, how rules are made, how policies are made, what kinds of policies there are, and even people in administrative positions, particularly leadership positions. Products and services. The organization has been offering a certain line of products for a number of years, and it decides, because of market demands, to offer another kind of product. It could be a new product, it could be discontinuing an old product, but one that's very familiar and maybe beloved by people. And so making those changes can be challenging for an organization, only because it's the thing you have to offer to the public. And if you make a change and you get it wrong, it could be very costly to the organization. Human resources, here we're talking about policies and incentives that might motivate people to work, benefits plans, etc. At LaSalle, we just underwent a major change. The same carrier that we've had for most of the 20-some years that I've been at LaSalle is now not our health plan carrier. For those of you who live in countries with sort of universal health care, don't have to worry about this so much, but our health insurance has changed, and so there's a number of things that had to be reviewed and understood by employees before that change actually happened. The reputation or the mission of the organization, the image or the mission of the organization, is another thing that could change. If for some reason, whatever it is your organization does isn't acceptable anymore, isn't valued anymore by the public, or the market, then you either have to change or cease to exist as an organization. I'm a big fan, or I was a big fan, of typewriters, for instance, and I actually still have one sitting in my home office, but and except for a few enthusiasts, however, there are very few people who type. We keyboard now on computers and tablets and everything else. So if I was a typewriter manufacturer about 30 years ago, I probably should have seen the writing on the wall and said, I need to get into another line of work. I need to change my mission, change the reputation of my organization, establish it in a new field. Some organizations have successfully done that, others have not. The next two changes are somewhat related. Skills, when you are trying to introduce new skills in the way that people do their job. For instance, management training that seeks to improve how people evaluate employees, seeks to improve how people watch a budget or keep a budget. There's a variety of skills like writing skills and speaking skills that workers develop throughout their work careers. However, sometimes these changes need to be implemented across a number of employees, a number of departments, and so in that sense they become a little bit bigger. The training and development course you'll take next month will explore these issues a little further. The final change, of course, is in culture. If the organization decides to change the values, try to manage the symbols and rituals of the organization, then that's a pretty significant thing. Again, the reason for pointing these out is that each of them are different kinds of changes that require different kinds of communication in order to be successful. Another characteristic of change is the extent to which the change is planned or unplanned. That is, was it intentional or not? Some of the things that I mentioned in the previous slide about the type of change, whether it was sudden or incremental, this is somewhat related to intentionality, but the bigger thing here is to what extent was the change strategically planned or whether it was sort of happened to the organization. A good example of this, I think, is the difference between identifying a problem within an organization, say through a communication audit, and implementing a training program that seeks to develop new skills, say sensitivity to coworkers or the way that you talk to or treat coworkers in the organization. This is different from a regulation or a law that's mandated by a government or other governing authority, licensing authority maybe for the organization. That particular kind of mandate might be passed, and the organization then might not have been planning to make that sort of change or that sort of investment at that point. We'll talk a little bit about this more in a second. The timing of the change, whether it's intended to be a short-term fix for something or something longer term. This coming semester, there are 2 faculty members in the communication department back in Philadelphia that are going to be on leave. And they teach 6 classes altogether and serve on committees and do some other stuff around the department. So for a semester, we have to figure out who is going to take those responsibilities and what they're going to do with them. Longer-term changes are things that are more fundamental to the organization. You change the structure, you change the culture. That they might, the change process as well as the after effects of that process might go on for years after the change is made. This is related a little bit to unplanned change, but the impetus for making the change, does it come from within through self-examination, an internal sort of impetus for change? People look around the organization and say, this isn't working and we need to do something differently? Or does it come from an external source, like the government or a regulatory agency? There might be more resentment if a change is sort of foisted upon, thrust upon an organization than there is from those changes where you decide, hey, I need to make this different myself. The communication, therefore, and the reason for making the change becomes more important for an external change. I will say, just parenthetically, that if there is an agency, government agency or whatever, that passes laws that force organizations to change, there's often a change communication plan associated from the government entity. So it's not just the organization on its own that has to make the adjustments and communicate about it. It's the government agency itself that also has a change communication plan to help make the change more palatable. The 6th characteristic is control. Who's involved in planning and implementing the change? Again, this is related to human resources, culture, and the structure paradigm that we talked about last week, and even to a certain extent, power. Who gets to identify whether or not a change needs to happen? Who gets to decide what the program is going to be to change it? Who gets to plan how that program is rolled out and how it's sold to people? Some organizations do it all at the top and things are announced and off you go. Other organizations use a more organic process to develop ideas from people within the organization for the need for change. And so there's not one inherently better than the other, but each of them has its consequences in terms of how vested people feel in the change. The final major characteristic of change to consider is the rate of adoption. The rate of adoption is basically how quickly it takes to implement a change and how long it takes to accept it and see the effects of the change. This is affected by some of the things we've spoken of already. So the perceived attributes of the innovation, does it seem like it's going to work for us and solve problems that we have or not? Obviously, those that have positive attributes that you think are going to work for the organization tend to be implemented more quickly than those that you have questions about. A second characteristic that affects the rate of adoption is the type of innovation decision. Is it external or internal? If it's internal, sometimes it takes a little longer to change because of a culture, but often if you see the need and everybody else in the organization sees a need, then off they go. If you had not perceived a need and some outside agency says make this change, then there's tendency to have a little foot dragging and take a little longer to make things happen. The communication quality, both in terms of identifying the need for change and announcing that and getting agreement on it, all the way to how the program is sold and communicated to the people who might be affected by it. Poor communication all along the pathway to making a change virtually ensures that the change will not take. The nature of the organization system or structure. A very dense organization with a lot of layers and levels and subdivisions to it will take a little longer to change. A lot of those subdivisions, and this is where power comes into things a little bit, if a subdivision has some power or sway in a current structure and somebody decides that structure should change and the other, that original department feels as if they're losing something, then there'll be more resistance and the rate of change will be slower. The extent of the change agent's promotion efforts, and this again relates to communication quality. How much telling and selling, listening and agreeing to, seeking collaboration happens throughout the change process. Those changes that aren't promoted or explained or rolled out to the people in the organization tend not to do so well. The approach to identifying and discussing computer changes at my beloved LaSalle used to be someone would come in and put a new machine on your desk and say, hey, your email's different, and then they would leave. That was not, usually without little warning, that those things were going to happen. Now, it's always nice to get a new computer, but it'd be even nicer to know how to run it. The change wasn't promoted, it wasn't communicated very well, and the adoption for new technology, adoption rate was a little slow. With all that in mind, now that we understand the characteristics of organizational change, we're going to look at the phases that change management efforts typically go through. There are 6 phases to most organizational changes, and I'll say that in organizational communication literature, as in public relations, phase models or stage models are very, very popular. So you might see other organizational change models that feature 8 steps in the change or 4 steps in the change. The one that I'm using here has 6 that I think hold up pretty well. The importance of understanding these steps is that they help you identify ways, places where you need to communicate. So beginning over here with phase 1, there's, and I'll talk a little bit more about communication in a moment. Here in phase 1, there's some pressure on the organization to change, either internally or The next key to understanding organizational change are the characteristics of adopters. We talked a little bit, I should say, about the communication model last weekend, and we have receivers of the information we have. In this case, we're looking at the receivers of an organizational change effort. It's sort of audience analysis, somewhat related to public relations, but it's understanding the types of people and how receptive they are, types of people you have in the organization and how receptive they are to change. There's a very popular change model related to adopters that's been around for probably about 40 years or so, but it still is very predictive. In fact, when I read a lot of technology articles about what's next, like driverless cars and all that, they talk a lot about adopters, particularly the first two categories. Moving from left to right, those are the first people to adopt a change, and the continuum basically is time. If you read across sort of the bottom part of the graph, that's time. How long does it take people to adopt a change? Innovators are people who not only adopt change quickly, they're often the ones coming up with ideas. They see a situation and they say, hey, we haven't tried this before. What's going to work? Early adopters are also very open to change, but they might not necessarily come up with the initial ideas in terms of what change should be made. But they understand the need for change, the available change options. They're excited about looking forward and getting the latest and greatest thing. If you have a friend who always needs the latest iPhone when it comes out and will wait out in line for hours to get one, then you have a sense of an early adopter. The early majority is a large group of employees who hear the change announcement. They look at the program or initiative that's going to be started, and they are relatively open-minded. They seek a little bit of evidence about whether the change has worked in studies up to this point or other organizations, but they're generally willing to try a change out, a new training program, new software, whatever, before they outright reject it. I should note that at any point along this change cycle, the public might say, we don't think this is a great change to begin with. We don't think this is a great solution to the change, the need for change that you've proposed here. So in that case, the process sort of reverts back to an earlier stage. The late majority also generally will accept whatever changes are coming down the pike, but they're a little bit more skeptical. They don't see the need for change. They don't completely understand whether this particular change initiative is going to work or not. And so they criticize the change. They are slow to begin to adopt the new technology or the new plan, and so it takes them a little longer to actually use what you have given them. Then the final group, which is kind of a funny one to think about, but laggards. Great word to say, laggards. Laggards are essentially those people who probably will never change. They like the way things are done. They like the traditions. They value the organization they've grown up to know and love, and they don't want to see it go off in another direction. These are people who will resist change to the bitter end. They're usually also the same people who wear flip phones to stay in touch on their mobile networks. I should note about laggards. Age does not necessarily make you a laggard. I know a number of older people who are innovators and early adopters. They're in their 80s and still thinking of new ideas and going to a lab every day and writing up results. So early adopters might not necessarily be the best late adopters in today's generations, right? So age does not mean that everybody who is over 50 is going to be a laggard. I'm speaking from personal experience here. We now take a look at the characteristics of adopters that influence the communication that you need to target toward them. Innovators, for instance, are venturesome. They like to try new things. They soak up information like sponges. They're always looking at future-oriented magazines. They're looking toward where the organization should be and the various creative things that might help them get there. If you are a manager of an organization or a CEO, you identify these people and feed them all the information they can handle. Have them go out and look for innovations. Have them go to trade shows where new vendors are talking about the next best thing. These are the people who will bring something back from a trade show and say, this is going to be the next iPhone, and it might just well be. Early adopters are respectable role models. These people have been established in the organization. They have taken some risks and tried some new things. They've been the guinea pigs for experiments in organizational change to see if something is going to work. And they have the respect and trust of people around the organization. So when they say, we might want to try this differently because we have a problem here, they are the ones that a change manager can turn to be somewhat of an ambassador for the new change that might be considered. The early majority are deliberate people. This means that they deliberate over a variety of options that might be available to them. So they don't just look at one and say, yes, that's the one I'm going to do. They're the ones who gather all the information, and they look at comparisons, and they look at reviews, and they look at studies that have used the two products or whatever in a particular way, and then they make a decision. It's not that they are slow at making decisions, it's just that they want all the information they possibly can before a decision is made. The late majority is skeptical. They still want to do all the research, but they've also been around the block a couple of times and understand that organizational change doesn't always work. It can also be costly and reduce the functioning of the organization. So they tend to be skeptical of any change efforts. What change agents need to do is sell them on the need for change and also on the probability that the adoption plan put forth before would be the best way to solve the problems that their organization faces. They need additional evidence, but they also need some convincing that it is the best thing in the interest of everybody in the organization. Laggards, there's not a whole lot you can do with them other than to try to tie a new innovation into something that's old and traditional. For instance, if an organization has always said we're about customer service or customers come first, we have customer service second to none, and yet they go through a change where they're bought out maybe by another organization that doesn't have the greatest reputation for customer service. I think of Philadelphia's local cable company, for instance, and some of the disruptions it's had and time it's taken to get things fixed there. The thing about it is, though, that these folks can be convinced over time that what you're trying to do ties into organizational values, the things that the organization has always done, and can be then used as ambassadors to help further the change. If you can get some of the late majority or laggards to become champions for change, then that's a good strategy. We come now to the end or near the end of the presentation by looking at some principles for communicating change, some good ideas and some strategies. Principle number 1. Beliefs and attitudes typically need to change before change is accepted. You probably talked a little bit about this in persuasion, and there's some different schools of thought about what needs to change before behavior is changed. But I think that it's generally accepted that attitudes and beliefs are things that you think are true, factual kinds of information. Attitudes are how you feel about something. Both those things need to change before a change is accepted. If I don't believe you need to change and I am skeptical and have a bad attitude toward the change, then I'm not going to do it. The biggest thing here is that the reason for making the change needs to be evident to those people involved. If it's not, then you need to keep at it until you've changed beliefs and attitudes to the point where they're going to accept and help you implement the actual change. It is usually a good idea to gain employee involvement kind of throughout the process. Now, I'll pause here and say that there are a lot of organizations that operate from sort of a command and control model, where the upper administration makes the decisions about major organizational changes, and everybody else down the food chain needs to communicate that and accept it. More recent management practices and management theory suggests that you need to get employees involved sort of throughout the process, identifying the need for a change. At UPS, again, it was frontline salespeople who identified the need for an organizational change there. Making the decision about what change is adopted. So you consider a variety of options, you get focus groups and people together to talk about it, and then vote perhaps on what option seems to be the best for employees at that time. And then finally, planning for its implementation. Frontline people are usually the ones who have to put a change into place, and so while somebody in Colorado in the United States might decide, well, everybody in their organization needs to do this, it might not always work particularly well for different cultures or different attitudes toward work and so on. And so planning for the getting people involved in how the implementation might be rolled out is an important thing. You need to articulate and explain the need for change, and I've identified this a little bit earlier as a principle of good communication about change. But if I don't know why I need to change my entire way of working, then I'm not going to accept it. I might outright reject you in terms of whether or not the organization is going to adopt something. The next principle for communicating change is to gain support and visibility from the top. Use the upper management of your organization as the source for messages about change, gaining support for the need for change, gaining support for whatever changes, new plans that you have to put in place, and a certain amount of visibility. People pay attention to, they might not always trust, but they pay attention to the people at the top of the organization. So if the CEO holds a town hall meeting for the company and announces that there's a significant need in the organization to make a change, and then discusses the way that they're going to go about developing a change decision-making model, then there's more likelihood that people are going to pay attention to that. A couple of years ago in the church that I worship at, we were asked, I was part of a group that was asked to implement a new program for introducing people to the faith. We worked in a small group to use the materials from the program. It was a nationwide program, and adapt them to our parish, figure out a way to announce it and roll it out, get people involved and everything else. But one of the key things that we needed was leadership from the pastor of the parish, who actually was the one who got us working on the project in the first place. However, and that leadership and visibility would have come from him making an announcement from the pulpit during weekend services that this change was coming. Here's how people could get involved. He never did that, and while there were some people ultimately signed up for the programs, and that it really was much smaller and much less successful than I thought it was going to be otherwise. Related to this is gaining support and understanding from the bottom. So people at the lower half of the organization need to support the need for change and also the change program itself. New technology, whatever new thing you're going to bring in, the people at the bottom need to understand that and support it. The understanding part really comes from whether or not they know how it works, what the impact is going to be on them and their jobs and their department, and that's an important communication job, especially if the change coming is a negative one. You need to carefully manage expectations. This is where a lot of change management programs founder, or when people report some dissatisfaction with them. A lot of programs are sold, on the idea that we're going to solve everything that's going wrong in your organization, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. In public relations programs, for instance, I know when I work on campaigns, we have to convince the client that we're not going to get 100% of the public knowing who they are and buying their product going flying off the shelves in 6 months. Right? We can let them know that the organization exists, and that might be about as far as we get in 6 months. People might know a little bit more about the product, and so they might buy a little bit more of it. But in terms of increasing sales by 100% or getting 100% of a public to adopt something, that's an unrealistic expectation. So you need to manage that for all adoptees, as well as anybody who hires you to actually do the messages. This goes back a little bit to communication technology and a little bit to talking about the communication model, but the more channels that you can implement and invoke to get the messages across and to convince people that the change is worth doing, getting them trained and everything else, the better off the change process is going to go. If you only use announcements and emails and changes in the website and that sort of thing to announce things, then there might be a challenge there. One of the things that I mentioned slightly the other last week was the idea that you might need to train messengers to help facilitate a change. A few years ago in the United States, a major financial services company moved its headquarters from its first traditional, everybody knew it and loved it building to another one in Cincinnati, Ohio, a state in the Midwest of the United States. So what they decided was to, rather than send messengers directly down the channel, that we will hire or encourage managers to be the people to talk with employees, to do the initial training on what the change would look like, how the move was going to look like, how they would be affected by moving from one place to another, how their commute would go. It was the frontline managers who did the bulk of the work on managing the announcement about the change. And it was remarkably successful. A lot of people were on board with the change, and the fact that the managers were able to help spread that message helped make that satisfaction happen. As the change process is happening, the new idea or technology or whatever is being rolled out, you need to report the results of how the change is working. If we said satisfaction is going to go up by adopting this new computer technology, then what happened? We rolled it out. Did we get it rolled out on time? Did people have the information they needed? And so on. If not, then we need to go back and adjust what it is we've been doing. If a change management project results in success, again, sales are up, people are happy, there's more money in their pocket, the organization is making more money, or whatever criteria you used, then it's not a bad thing to have a party. At the end of a successful campaign or at the end of a successful communication intervention, if things are working better than they were before, it's probably time to celebrate that. Friday happy hours are a good way, in my mind, of doing that. The final thing I'd like to talk about here is the change process in your communication audits. Audits, first of all, can help produce change. You diagnose an issue and you offer a prescription in the audit, the full communication audit. Now, in your audits, all you're doing is offering a description of how you would go about diagnosing the problem. So we're not going to be there yet at the end of this class. But diagnosis leads to prescription. If I examine somebody in the physician's office and something is wrong, I'm going to prescribe a way of helping that. In order to help this process happen, if the audit does in fact produce change, you need to present the results clearly. You might have asked a lot of questions, got a lot of statistics and all of that, but the way that you present those results with sort of compelling evidence and an example or two about what would happen if the change were implemented can influence people. Right. The other thing that happens as a result of an audit is that you might identify several places where things need to be changed, but you might also identify some places or some things that would be worth retaining, worth holding on to. So you need to clearly tell everybody who's involved what needs to be changed, but you also have to, hold a celebration or somehow celebrate the fact that not everything was bad. In your audit, in a full communication audit, as opposed to just the proposal, you need to make recommendations for a change. These changes could, come under a variety of categories, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those are and what they might mean here in a sec. As you're thinking about it, though, you need to identify whether your respondents have the knowledge to make the change you think they should. So it's one thing to say, we need every employee to adopt a Microsoft Outlook as their calendar and email function. And if people don't know how Microsoft Office works or are Mac people or whatever, then there's a certain level of knowledge that needs to be communicated in order for them to understand the change and actually make it. Many change efforts have foundered because the consultants thought that people knew more than they actually did. Do they have the capability within their job to make the change happen? So if you have no authority over another unit, you've done a communication audit and you say, look, these people have some issues they need to work on, and yet you have no influence or control over their job descriptions or anything else, then you might not be able to affect the change that you think needs to happen. Can your organization afford to make the change? This is a big one for a lot of organizations, and particularly with technology. It is very tempting and somewhat needed sometimes to keep up with the latest and the greatest of anything. And yet, if you don't have the cash to pay for that, then the organization itself might go into debt. There's been several examples of this where it became just too expensive for an organization to adopt a particular change and it had to be postponed for a while. Now, it can become a budgeting target over the course of several years, but sometimes it might not necessarily happen when you think it should. This goes back to a couple of questions I've asked before, but is there support for making the change, sort of up the organization from management and down the organization from other employees, and even across from departments with which you might have to work? The final thing I'll say about change and communication audits is that you can use an audit to actually monitor progress and the process that the change goes through. So if you announce a technology addition and you have it rolling out over 3 months in the organization, one thing you can do either midway through the implementation of the technology or toward the end of that process is ask some questions. Were you happy with the change? Do you feel people have explained it well to you? If you had your druthers, is there anything you would change about the way the change process occurred? Right? And the results of an audit for a communication change program means that the next iteration of both interviewers as well as those who help with the equipment that Gear Up uses will have more resources in a family-friendly way. And so that audit process you can ask people those questions during the process. Are they satisfied with it? Did they get enough information? Do they know what's going on? Is there anything more that they need to know, etc.? One of the things I've done is taken an audit report satisfaction report that was done, I believe, in the middle of a change. And a company asked the people, the adoptees, what they thought about what was going on. And it gives you a nice, reasonably quick and simple survey that you can use to assess the change process. This is the end of the lesson on communication and change. I encourage you to go to the self-study, self-assessment questionnaire, which asks you to review a change that happened in an organization that you are familiar with, very similar to the first set of questions. This particular one by GE Healthcare will tally the results at the end and give you a sense of how well the process was managed, whether it was good or poor, and suggestions for making it better the next time. With that, I bid you adieu.